Hello, welcome to Estonian Real Podcast. My name is Matti and my today's guest is Cory Grewell. He's a literature professor and he wrote a couple of articles about how science became religion and why reading great literature is protect you from mind control. Cory, thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you.
So can you introduce yourself for those who don't know you and what your hobbies, what your school went and so on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my name is Dr. Cory Grewell. I'm a professor of literature at Patrick Henry College, which is a small Christian liberal arts college in Purcellville, Virginia. That probably doesn't help a lot of you if you're not local, but it's a small town about an hour northwest of Washington, D.C., so suburban Washington, D.C. in Virginia. I've been teaching literature here for going on 9 years. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana, which is in the northwest of the United States, and have got a PhD from Northeastern University in Boston in 2008, and have been teaching English and literature ever since. I like to read and write, as probably most English literature professors do. I also enjoy golf, although I'm not very good at it, and cooking and eating.
That's great. But before we go to the articles, that you like you said in the articles, you talked about how language used to protect science, but can you give a little bit overview what science is? Because from me and the other people who listening is they have very some basic understanding, but so can we give more depth view about science?
Yeah, I mean, and my article was concerned with how science is how the term science is used in the current culture and political discourse. As I said, I'm a professor of English literature, so I mean I'm not a scientist myself, but I mean my understanding of science, having gone through schools always and reading people like Francis Bacon, who in one of the senses was one of the fathers of science in the West, is that it's a field of study that asks questions and deals primarily with the natural universe, is a basis for technology and so forth, and provides us many important answers to questions about how the world works around us, and gives us a lot of technologies. Actually, Bacon said this about science, and one of its important things is it allows us to have some control over the universe around us. But recently, and one of the things that particularly in responses in public discussion and discourse to the COVID controversy is, and I address this in my article, is how the term "the science" is thrown around as if science were some sort of monolith, which it's not, as I understand it. I mean, there's obviously tens of thousands of scientists conducting research on a number of things all the time. The other thing I would defer to people who are scholarly scientists in this regard, but again, an understanding that oftentimes science by definition is not a closed field of study that reaches sort of dogmatic conclusions that become articles of faith about things. And again, it's that the language tends to use references to the science in that regard. In the article I referenced, for instance, our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, referring to the science, as the answer to any number of things that in my understanding science sometimes doesn't even address. So that was, that's kind of my concern is in the article is that the way that the term is being used, and that really, I mean, to come right down to it, that science, again, not as a field of study or a discipline, but as a collection of articles of faith, comes to almost replace religion in the public discourse.
When the media talked about this climate crisis and climate change, one of the punchline was that 98% climate scientists agree that climate change is man-made. But is this a fact true, or is how the science actually work?
Yeah, well, that's kind of that's a little bit Martin, a little bit. It's sort of out of my my field of expertise, but I do think that once again, from my understanding of science, once again, it's I mean, science tends to reach sort of tentative conclusions that are open to revision with new data, and I think climate change is another one of those areas where linguistically the term has probably been used somewhat incorrectly, which is not to say that I'm I mean my armchair quarterbacking reaction is I'm sure that seems fairly obvious that we probably have had some influence on the climate. How much I really don't know, but I am somewhat skeptical again of the way that the term sometimes gets used as if it were some sort of infallible and unchanging authority, right? That we could look to again in the same way that we look to for religion, because religion tends to make statements, right, based in belief in God, which is transcendent and ineffable, and science by its very nature is not. And so it seems to me that the mistake is to use the same sort of religious language that we would use in reference to the authority of a divine, transcendent, ineffable, unchanging figure to refer to something that is actually our own methodological field of research. And I think that climate change is another field where perhaps the abuse of language with reference to science has come into play.
Okay, but okay, you mentioned that in article that the certain language they use refers to it's like more like a religion or than science. Then can you be more specific at what kind of language we talk about?
Yeah. So in the and I think if I have this in front of me, I can look in the article that I wrote on for the Federalist on the use of science, for instance. This is directly what Nancy Pelosi said. I quoted her in this. She says, "In my earlier comments, I said science, 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 and science. On almost any subject you can name, science is the answer." And that's a very broad, sweeping use of the term, right? It's, I mean, and again, the language to me strikes me as almost religious. Whatever your problems in life, science is the answer. And I don't think that's true. I think that there are a number of problems in life that science can answer if it's within its field of its proper lane, so to speak. If it's addressing the problems that science was meant to address. But I don't know that I would. Once again, we're falling back on religious language. I don't know that I would put faith in it, so to speak, in such a general and broad sweeping sense. So that's kind of the abuse. I also later in the article refer to the fact that, and I quoted here that one of the things that inspired the article was I was reading an article by a man named Richard Weaver, who was a rhetorician. He wasn't a scientist either, but he was a rhetorician in the 20th century, mid 20th century in America. And he mentions in his article a number of terms that he says once we do away with sort of transcendent ideas of truth. He was a big he was heavily influenced by the philosopher Plato, but he said once we do away with these transcendent ideas, a number of other terms will sort of have to take their place in language, and science he cites as one of those. But in that article, he says science is not univocal or a monolith. And in other words, by its nature, I think you mentioned earlier, right, 98% of scientists might agree on something. Well, that still means that there's 2% of scientists that don't agree. And there have been cases in history where a very small minority of scientists have turned out to be right. So when you use the term the science, right, in English, right, that indicates, well, there's 100% consensus. And my understanding of science is there's rarely cases where there's 100% consensus. That oftentimes the question is usually something that's still open. I mean, there might be, if we were to speak more precisely about it, there might be much greater probability, of one conclusion than another. For instance, maybe according to the research that's done, and again, I'm not terribly familiar with the research, but maybe according to the research that's done, there is a great probability, right, that we are affecting the climate. But I'm, is there 100% consensus? I'm not sure that there is. So that's kind of the thing, that use of the definite article, the science, and that's, I'm not meaning to attack any particular scientific pronouncement, that from scientific community, so to speak, but the use of language, I think, is just I think it indicates sort of a replacement of religion with science in the culture, and you can see it in the language.
But okay, let's go like specific. Okay, what word they use that like say give like more authority than is more close to like religion than science?
Yeah, well, I think if we were to speak precisely about science, I think we would probably tend to use the term scientists, right, and refer to the individual scientists performing the work. And I think that just even that use of the the plural noun to refer to the scientists, indicates the truth that there is a body of scholars who have reached a certain sort of hypothesis or conclusion. But it wouldn't refer to, again, a sort of a set of dogma coming out of the science, right? That we would sort of put our faith in as having set down, unchangeable conclusions in this regard. So that's, I mean, and again, my concern is really one that has more to do with cultural use of language than with scientific conclusions themselves, and that's just science is not really my field of expertise, but I am concerned with how the language is being used. But as far as specific scientific pronouncements, the a majority might believe, but could turn out to be incorrect. I suppose it could be any of them. I'm not qualified really to speak to those at the moment. But I guess sure there are certain sorts of pronouncements I might be more skeptical about than others.
But in your article, you point out like this like 4 words that believe, listen, trust, and follow.
Yeah. Well, and again, and in the article, those are sorts of things that I mean, those are all terms that come out of at least in English, those are terms that come from religious practice. I mean, as you said, believe, follow, listen. Those are all imperative verbs that historically have been used. I mean, they've historically been used, for instance, in the Christian religion, to instruct believers. Believe the word of God, follow these sorts of things, listen to what they say. Now, they can be used in other contexts, of course, but they have a sort of religious significance when they're used in the sense of here's the truth and here's how you act in accordance with it. I mean, and that's, again, I mean, going all the way back to the early church, following or even the New Testament texts, those verbs are used in that way. And what I notice is that those imperative verbs, here's what you must do, right? Even morally speaking, in response to this truth, those verbs are now being used. It's sort of transferred into the field of discourse such that the science takes the God position, and we are believers in the science, and therefore there are moral things we must do in response to the science. And that, to me, I've said it before, but that to me is that's what I was trying to get at in that article, is that the language of religion has now moved into how we are told, right, in culture, that we ought to use their term, follow, right, the science.
Is it this like change been like recently? Because I understand that with this current pandemic, these phrases are used, but these are more like a very early signs, like 80s or 90s, that this thing was like coming into play.
Yeah, I think it's, that's a good point. I mean, and I take your observation there. I think it has, for most of us, kind of recently, become very poignant in response to the pandemic. But I think you're right. I mean, I think some of this language has been it has been sort of creeping in for quite some time. I mean, for instance, climate change is another sort of scientific belief, right? In some senses that has what do I want to say, is spawned or engendered the use of these terms as well, and that's been around at least since the 90s. And I mean, you know, we were mentioning in conversations earlier, you know, sorts of you know, the AIDS epidemic in the 80s sort of beginning this conversation as well. So I think it's been coming and growing, I guess, in some senses in Western discourse. But it yeah, and maybe it's because the pandemic affects everybody, right? And there's sort of really more broad sweeping qualifications. But yeah, I think that, and it's interesting as you bring this up, that there seem to be a sort of moral dimension to it, right? I mean, there's a sort of truth that the science, so to speak, articulates, and then there's a sort of moral action that is required of people in response to it. Currently, right, there's a sort of, in the United States at least, there's a moral, many will say there's a sort of moral imperative to get vaccinated or and or wear a mask or social distance, these sorts of things in response to the pandemic. Obviously, with climate change, right, there is this moral responsibility to, you know, buy a car with a smaller engine, or you know, take public transportation to work, or these various sorts of things. And even earlier, I mean, this is stretching my memory a little bit, but I remember, you know, that there was a sort of moral valence surrounding the AIDS epidemic. I mean, there was, you know, one of the things there, and I actually think that perhaps, you know, the reference to science in that discussion might have been healthy in some senses, because it moved the discussion of the epidemic from sort of this a situation of moral judgment to one of medicine. But it is interesting that there too you have this sort of there's a morality to it, and that I think is curious, because if you look at the history of science back into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, so to speak. I mean, my understanding of science is one of the interesting things about it is that scientific inquiry is sort of goes on apart from, you know, any sort of moral weight, right? That morality is actually itself a sort of religious or a philosophical thing. Science is more of a material field of inquiry, and it's interesting how in the last 20, 30 years, a great deal of morality, right, seems to have attached itself to science, which again, I almost wish we had a scholarly scientist on with us, because I'd be interested to see, you know, what a scientist would think about that. It seems to me in some senses it might be something that's alien to the discipline to say there's all this moral weight, right, to what's going on. But certainly in cultural discourse, it seems to me that there is a sort of, you know, almost religious appeal to moral action that's attached to pronouncements of the science again.
Can we like make assumption that something like this, because Western culture is pretty much abandoned this like Christian version of God, we like, okay, want to like find a substance for it, and that thing I thought that science was like a very good one, and that it was this like reason.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. If I'm understanding you correctly, that there's, I mean, as you know, I mean, Nietzsche said, what, 100 and some or 30 odd years ago, you know, God is dead, and that was meant as a sort of descriptive term of where Western culture is going. That Western culture is removing itself really from having to answer to God. That conceptually God, you know, is no longer in the room, and I think. Yeah, I would agree with the sort of thing. If God exists and created us, then it only stands to reason that we, you know, our wiring is to look for some sort of God figure, some sort of authority, and if God has sort of left conceptually from Western culture, then something needs to take its place. And I think you can make a very strong argument that you know that the capital S science, right, has sort of stepped into that role in much of culture, but that's never something, to my understanding, you know, science that's never something science has claimed to be. And the flip side of that is also that if God exists, we can't will him into existence. I mean, that's kind of, that's beyond our ability to do, whether we want to or not. Right? His existence is not dependent on our belief.
Yeah. But let's move on this second article that talks about that why you should read great literature and how they can protect you from mind control. Also, your article starts with that how this say ideological language is just got in has come to universities, like, and there was a professor like going along with it, and enlightened. I'll speak more about it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, what the interesting thing I was considering there is you know, what he who or she, you know, who controls the language, you know, sort of controls thought. And I had reference there to George Orwell's novel 1984, right? And one of the things that, interestingly enough, that the Ministry of there's a division of the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's novel, right? One of the things they're trying to do is reduce language, right? So that you have fewer words, and also to abstract them so that they don't have concrete references, and that this would make it much more easy, you know, for Big Brother to control how people think. Because and there's, I remember back in graduate school talking about, you know, competing theories from cognitive psychologists. Do we actually need language in order to think, or is there a way we can think without language? And there's some sort of, we went back to sort of studies to pre-linguistic cultures and infants before they can talk, and you know, try to guess, can we you know, think in terms independent of language. But I guess the thing is, really, with sort of the conclusion gets reached that whether we can or not, we don't, right? I mean, adult human beings think, right, in terms of language. Language is that's how we articulate our thoughts, even to ourselves, right? And so the idea there, I think this is what Orwell was getting at, is that if you can control the available language to a populace, you can really control their thought. And this, you know, again, in the Ministry of Truth, on one hand, this was simply the number of words available. As I said, they wanted to reduce the number of words and also reduce their reference to things that were completely abstract. I think both of those are important, right? Because a wider range of vocabulary allows for a wider range of thought. The other thing is, when words have reference to, you know, sort of concrete, not just objects, but concrete experiences and feelings, they're sort of more, I mean, how do I want to say this? They're more subjective, which doesn't mean they mean whatever you want them to be. It means that the person who is speaking or thinking is more in control independently of their thoughts, because they have reference to their own experience. And so what Big Brother is trying to do is to say, we can limit this, right? We can limit both the number of words and the available meaning of the words to just abstractions that we control. And I think to some extent, so in this article, you know, one of the things I said was, well, let me back up and say it this way. One of the things I argued in the article is that the Academy, and I, you know, made reference to an old instructor I used to teach with years ago, who'd like to, you know, disabuse students, right, of their sort of understanding of language. And what she would do is sort of, I think, in some senses, cut off, right, those available meanings and experiences that those students had, and even with literary text or their own writing, and say, well, this is what you really mean, right? This is what these words really mean, and therefore to sort of control the range of meaning. And I'm speaking sort of vaguely, but what I mean by that is so for instance, in the West right now, there's a lot of revision of the literary canon going on, and a lot of effort to say that even texts like Homer, for instance, aren't, you know, the Homeric poems aren't articulating a vision of sort of heroism or ideal humanity. They're articulating rather, you know, the sorts of ideas of patriarchy or of oppression of various groups. And this, that's not to say that the politics, the sort of aristocratic politics represented they're sort of taken as a context in Homer may or may not do those things. But it is to say that the text is bigger than that, right? That there's something in the poem that appeals to, the human sensibility that expands our frame of reference in terms of language and thought, imagination. And my argument is that reading those texts, Homer, Shakespeare, Ernest Hemingway, Dostoevsky, right? Any of these sorts of people, right? That expands our sort of imagination, and will ultimately make it harder to control thought, because our imaginations have a much broader frame of reference, right? I mean, our linguistic resources in terms of what we're even capable of thinking are so much broader, and I think that's also it's no coincidence, right, that I think throughout history you can say fairly, there may be exceptions, I can't think of any, but free societies have been reading societies, and vice versa, right? I mean, when governments, oppressors, want to limit freedom, one of the things that they need to do is limit the imaginations of the populace, right? Because the more we can sort of read, or the more we do read, the more we can conceive imaginatively and think, the more language that's available. Also, the better truth meter, right, that we have, because we can tell when someone says to us, someone says to us, for instance, and this is one of the things I'm thinking now. I'm thinking through and preparing an article on sort of the death of heroism in the West, because I think that one of the things we're doing right now in culture, particularly literary culture, is we're going through and we're just debunking all of our heroes and saying, no, there's nothing heroic here. And I think that's terribly detrimental to a society, because I think we want, heroes and ideals to sort of look up to. But to provide a specific example, for instance, if someone says to us, no, there are no heroes, the hero is a mystifying construct that is led to that it is simply a tool, right, for the oppressors to maintain a status quo. If we're grounded in things like Homer or Beowulf, or the classical epics, or even, I mean, for that matter, enough Marvel comic books, right? I mean, if we have a sort of developed imaginative conception that sort of hits us in the soul, right, in the gut, right? Well, this is that when you're telling me that a hero is a construct that's meant to mystify me and keep me down, that doesn't square with what I read, right? I've got too much of an imaginative concept of a hero built up in my mind, and what that concept tells me is that, as a human being, created in the image of God with an eye to the transcendent, there's much more that I'm capable of, right, than just being a cog in the wheel. That sort of lie that this is just a construct, it's not going to work, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one of the things I was getting at there, that if the maintenance of reading, these sort of great texts, expands our minds and imagination such that we're not able to be, you essentially can't control the thought of someone who reads widely.
But I think, look, if going back like this, what Pelosi said, that using like this, like science says, like this, like putting us, we have the authority, like, and use us to do what we're told, and it's just kind of limiting our thoughts, limiting our language. It's okay, we just be a little born just.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think the two are related, or can be, and often are related, because you're getting at a good point. I mean, I think one of the things is, so the hero, these sorts of literary concepts, for instance, right, that these are metaphysical things, and so we're told, right, that this isn't real, right? It's a sort of, it's a political construct it's a political construct developed to maintain an economic status quo, right? So that when we, I mean, when we read through a work like, Shakespeare's Hamlet, for instance, and have this sort of discussions of virtue. Well, what is virtuous about Hamlet? What does he do wrong? And once again, there's those questions of morality. Well, no, that's a construct. We're just making that up. That's to come right down to it. That's not true, right? Science is true, right? What is material is true. And I'm not, I don't want to sound, I hope I'm not coming across sounding like, someone with a, wearing a tinfoil hat, so to speak, denying what's right in front of my face. I certainly believe that science does give us a great deal of truth. But it speaks to a great deal of physical or material truth. The transcendent metaphysical truths, right, or those aren't the purview of science. Those are the purview of theology, philosophy, literature, and those things are no less true, right? Simply because they're not, empirical or physical or observable. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and here's of course what from my perspective is sort of the pernicious thing. As I've said a number of times, I'm not a scientist, but neither is Nancy Pelosi, right? I mean, I one of the reasons I wouldn't make recourse to science as a repository of authority is because I'm not a scientist, right? So I wouldn't feel comfortable simply referring to it as an authority for my claims. But she's not either, right? And I think that, and she's not the only one. I think there are a number of people in public, a number of public figures who in their discourse are making this recourse to the science as a sort of, this is truth. Theology, philosophy, literature, these sort of metaphysical truths, well, they're debunked, right? Those aren't true. Those are simply mystifications because they're not scientific. And that, I mean, I think that, again, just recourse to our own experience, I think that cuts off a good, portion of what it means to be a human being in terms of being truth, because our own experience tells us that these metaphysical things, right, that these aspects of morality, for instance, aspects of religion, they have reality and they are important. So yeah, I hope that made sense. But and again, if I understood you right, yeah, we're being told, again, to come back to that term believe. Don't believe these sorts of things that appeal to your imagination and soul, right? Believe these sorts of things that appeal to science. There's two things wrong with that. One is that these things, pertinent to the imagination and soul are real. And the second is the assumption that they somehow don't work in concert with each other, which I think is also false, right? I mean, I don't think that it needs to be one or the other. I mean, we can certainly, and should, right, study and pursue, right, the conclusions that science reaches and the sort of more material sciences, right, without necessarily neglecting matters of philosophy and theology and literature in that regard as well. I mean, again, right, said earlier, if God exists, our belief in him is immaterial to his own existence. The truth of these transcendent matters is not dependent, right, on our believing them. If they're true and we don't believe them, that doesn't make them not true. It just makes us stupid, right?
Do you feel familiar with Jordan Peterson and his statements about science and religion?
Yeah.
It's because I remember that as I understand that in his point of view that science and religion cannot coexist, but you have to keep the very clear difference. What is what?
Yeah, that's I'm not familiar with that particular. I know Jordan Peterson, but I'm not familiar with that particular conversation. So he said that science and literature.
I think it's not that what he said, but it's like my impact that they, my understanding about what he's saying. But what is your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that it's an interesting sort of thing. My thoughts at this point is they sort of address different. In one sense, at least, they address different aspects and of being a human being and different aspects of reality, really. Not always. I mean, obviously, science fiction, right, is something that takes science and then adds the sorts of work of the imagination and the appeals to sorts of things, emotion and morality and so forth. So I think they can coexist, and they can work in concert. I mean, I think to some extent, they're reality, right, is constructed by the divine as a number of aspects, and we as human beings are necessarily finite in our view of it. So I mean, literature sort of is looking at reality from one angle, science from another. I think they certainly can exist and work in concert, right? And I think if here's the thing, if and when we've got it right, the findings of science and what science tells us is true, and the findings of sort of literature and the imagination and what this tells us is true, if we've got it right, there shouldn't be any contradiction, right? They shouldn't be pulling away from each other. They should be working in concert to tell us the same thing from different angles. That's my thought in any case. I'm not 100% sure how that jives with that particular statement you were referring to from Jordan Peterson, but I think that's my thought at this point.
Also, let's come back to this. Why does like a university like accept this like a logical mindset that like this really, I think it was Shakespeare like was take out from high school curriculum.
Yeah.
Because it was like offensive for someone, but behind that is like, okay, we have to control it, but this is like excuse.
Yeah. No, I think so. I mean, there's a sort of sense to cut things from the curriculum because they offend somebody. I mean, I remember when I was teaching, I was teaching actually at high school in California, and the African American students weren't required to read. It was interesting because it had not been cut from the curriculum yet, but Mark Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn, they simply allowed African American students to opt out of that, because it's had offensive use of language. Now, I don't want, and I'm not sure whether, I mean, obviously that's I can't I don't have not being an African American myself, I don't have the sort of experience with being offended in the same way, or I can't speak to their offense, I guess is what I'm saying, and I don't want to deny that because it's not my experience. I don't want to speak for them, so I'm not sure whether that was necessarily the correct decision or not, but I do think that it illustrates something that we should be very careful about, which is just to say, okay, because this work of literature is offensive to someone, it's no good. I do think there's an awful lot in Twain's novel, for instance, and actually, ironically, specifically addressing the American history of oppression, right, of African Americans. I mean, Twain is a satirist, so one of the things that he does in that novel is show racism to be silly. Really, I mean, stupid and silly and laughable, and so he actually makes a point that is, I think, conducive, right, to the growth and morality of American culture. Now he happens to do so in ways that use a language that is or has been, maybe continues to be, right, offensive to at least African American readers, quite possibly more than that, right? But I mean, part of that is probably because the difference between our sort of cultural sensitivity now and the cultural sensitivity when Twain wrote. So I don't know. In some senses, maybe it was what came to mind. Maybe it wasn't the best example, simply because of that issue of language. But I, you mentioned some works of Shakespeare. If we sort of remove these sorts of things from the curriculum simply because they're offensive in certain cases, I think we really need to be careful about what we're losing in terms of what they actually have to add in terms of well, the imaginative and moral truth, right, that's there as well. So and again, it really goes back to that idea of what I was saying earlier about Orwell and the range of thought, right? If draw it to this point, and this is where I think, you know, the example of Mark Twain is important too. If simply because something is offensive, or if using potential offensiveness becomes a weapon, right, to throw things down, to use Orwell's term, the memory hole, to remove this not just from an official curriculum, but to remove this from culture entirely, that sets a precedent where we really narrow down, right, or what's available for us in terms of thinking, right? We lose the experience to build our imaginations and to build our range of thought. And so that's kind of my word of caution there for people, you know, within the academy, who would want to just, you know, cut the curriculum because X, Y, or Z might be offensive, because Twain or Shakespeare or Homer might, you know, be offensive to somebody. It also might, you know, in some senses open their imagination, which is not to say I want to subject someone, you know, to you know, emotional trauma by reading something that is offensive to them, but that's an individual thing, right? It's not a curricular thing. I mean, if there's an individual or individuals who are having issues, can deal with that on an individual level. But I think as far as our culture goes, it's imperative that we continue to have, right, access to these works and that have shaped our culture for the better. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit of roundabout way of answering the question, but that's kind of the point.
But can you explain why like professors in your experience go along with that, or what is their like excuse? Okay, even though that we assume that they should know better. Okay, this is wrong. We don't know supposed to do that, but still.
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer, I think, is and again, I'm always a little bit hesitant speaking for somebody else, because it's not how I would think. But this is my understanding. I think that the thought there is that well, I know this is the case, right? Louis Althusser, for instance, right, was a Marxist theorist from 19th or 20th century, but he said that these, you know, what he called ideological state apparatuses are the sort of institutions of culture that work to oppress somebody. And in our own day of age, right, offense has become sort of synonymous with oppression. So what these sort of professors who are going along with the reduction of the curriculum are doing, I think, is they're saying, okay, this text, because it maintains these sorts of offensive things. I mean, so Mark Twain's, you know, use of the N-word, for instance, right, maintains a racist vocabulary, and therefore it's an instrument of oppression. And therefore, if we're going to liberate society and culture, that work of oppression needs to go, right? So that we get rid of that. Or for instance, take something even like, you know, I mean, Homer, for instance, I think this was one of the reasons that they used to sort of excise the Odyssey from a curriculum in a school in Massachusetts. And they excised it from the required reading curriculum, is my understanding. It's still available, but they just don't have it on the reading list for the required works of classes. But the logic seemed to be Homer's work perpetuates a sort of patriarchal norm, right, and a classist norm, that the upper class males are dominant in society, and that other classes are put down. So this is the way it works, right? A work of literature has in it something that offends an oppressed group or class, therefore it perpetuates oppression, therefore it needs to go, right? And so I think that's the reasoning behind this, right? The sort of narrowing down of curriculum is seen as a way of doing away with oppression. And even the other thing is, by the way, even when these works aren't cut from the curriculum as a whole, they're sort of presented in classes in such a contextualized way that, for instance, rather than seeing Hamlet's dilemma as a sort of metaphysical one of like, what is the right thing to do when I'm aware that an authority figure is guilty of some sort of major crime, and it's been put on me to set things morally right, rather than looking at that sort of dilemma as a moral dilemma. But what we do is we examine the politics, right? And we put the play in terms of a politics of oppression and victimization, and who are the oppressors, who are the victims, and we recontextualize it in such a way that its actual metaphysical weight is really kind of neutered. And so even if we keep the works the way they're presented, loses that reference to what is transcendent and real, from my perspective at least, in that regard. So I think, but that's why, right? You asked the question, why do they go along with this sort of thing? And I think that's the idea, that the most important thing about even a literary curriculum becomes this idea of doing away with oppression, which is a noble goal. But I mean, I think that, the short history of Marxist governments in the world has shown us that those attempts to do away with oppression tend to lead to heavier sort of totalitarian oppression. They haven't yet turned into some grand liberation.
If you think that this Huckleberry Finn, that say, okay, this like offensive, like for African Americans, but if those people who read this literature, like Homer or Iliad, Odyssey, for example, do they understand that current cultural context? Okay, what is like cultural norm that time, and what is and how people thinking and so on? Do people understand this, or they just they don't have access to this information?
That's a good question. I mean, and I think that's that's a really good question, because I think that you really do have to have some understanding of the cultural context in which it's written in order to get at the sort of imaginative truths and morals that are in a work. I mean, Huckleberry Finn's a great example. I think, and maybe this was one of the reasons that it becomes so offensive to high school students, is they're not understanding that it's written in an America that was much different culturally than an America that we live in right now. And so or similarly, right, the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey is different than the world that we live in now. So that's a good point. And I think one of the jobs of the teacher of literature is to make sure that his or her students understand that context, so that they can make meaning responsibly, right, out of the literary text that they're reading. So yeah, I do think that the context is important, but I also think that and this is kind of ironic and paradoxical. I think there are timeless and transcendent ideals and morals in the text that ironically become clearer to us if we understand the specific sort of historical and cultural circumstances in which the texts were written. But I think that might be the case, right? I mean, I suspect some of the misunderstanding may be due to the fact that readers of these texts aren't, right, cognizant of sort of the historical and cultural circumstances in which the texts were written. I mean, if you look at the language that Mark Twain throws around in Huckleberry Finn and aren't making allowance for the fact that he is channeling what was in fact the language of the 19th century in the American South.
Can you bring an example from Huckleberry Finn? What language we specifically talked about?
Yeah, well, he's the N word. I mean, that word is thrown around a great deal. I mean, it's just used as sort of matter of factly. I mean, but that is, I think that was, and it's not just the use of the word. I mean, there's many passages in which African Americans are talked about as if they were, really weren't full human beings. But in the context, at least according to when I recollect reading the novel, in the context, when that is done, it is done to show the ignorance and sometimes flat out stupidity of the speaker, right? In other words, Twain is sort of using that discourse to make fun of the person who's speaking in the novel as not being very smart, because they conceive of African Americans as less than fully human, right? So there's a satirical element to that. But if a high school student is not sensitive to either the historical circumstances or right the literary use of satire to make fun of the person that's speaking, wow, yeah, I mean, I can see where they would come away from a novel thinking, wow, this is just horribly offensive, right? Because the language that the person speaking in the novel using is horribly offensive, but Twain is intending that to make fun of the speaker, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that's a good example.
Let's talk about, let's going back to the science article that you mentioned this science demand sacrifices. Can you go talk about more about it?
Yeah. Well, and actually, I think the idea there was that that was, if I'm remembering correctly, that was directly a quote from Weaver, and he's saying that the religion demands a sacrifice, and this is the case, all the way back to primitive paganism to it's right there at the center, right, of Christianity. I mean, the center of Christian belief is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who comes and dies, sacrifices himself for the sins of mankind. In the Old Testament, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, there's a sacrifice like of animals, right, that were sacrificed for atonement. I mean, pagan religions had to some extent the same thing, but and even into modern practices of religion, I mean, that there is, that there's the sacrifice of our time, right? I mean, Islam, for instance, requires its adherents to pray 5 times a day. There's a stop what you're doing and pray. So there's always a sacrifice of something, whether it's material possessions, of freedom, or to say, ultimately at the center of the Christian religion, right, the sacrifice of God's own Son, right, for us. So there's always a sacrifice. And it was another one of those points I was making, that this is a sense in which science is starting to wade into the realm of religion, when there are moral imperatives that are given to us that we must sacrifice something, right, in order to I guess you'd say, to put it in religious terms, in order to achieve the favor, or to receive the favor of the science. And I am aware, as I say this, right, that someone might say, well, no, this is just a reasonable conclusion. For instance, right, the fact that one in much of the world, in response to the recent COVID pandemic, has been forced to sacrifice, quite frankly, their businesses, right? Small numbers of small businesses have been shut down due to the lockdowns, or even something as small as you have to wear a mask. I mean, that's something of a sacrifice of certain sorts of freedoms, and I'm aware that someone might say, well, that's not a sacrifice, that's just a logical conclusion you reach, right, due to the science. And it could be, except that once again, when you look, for instance, look at social media and the way people talk about this, they don't talk about this in the language of logical conclusions. They talk about it in the language of moral imperatives, right, that is directly parallel to the language that would traditionally be used of religion. You must attend church on Sunday. You must pray 5 times a day. You have to sacrifice these sorts of things. And it's given as a moral imperative. The language on social media in response to the science oftentimes carries that same sort of moral weight of sacrifice. And I thought it was interesting that Richard Weaver, 60 years ago, identified the same sort of thing as a linguistic phenomenon. Right, 60 years ago, he said, religion demands sacrifice. Science is also, going to demand sacrifice as it moves into the position, right, of the godlike authority in religion. And it turns out that that's the case, right? Climate change is another one. I mean, there's a sort of moral imperative of sacrifice that's enjoined on us, and that's I mean, look, I don't mean to say that I don't see the reasonableness of taking public transportation, or if you don't need it, driving a car with a smaller engine. I mean, that those things make a certain amount of sense. But what I do want to draw attention to is the way that the language sort of tends to replace God with science. in discourse.
How like people can like protect themselves this kind of like mind control? I understand there's like pretty much everything like this kind of psychological warfare, like laying words with, and what people like everyday person, for example, like me, can do just to protect myself.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's I mean, ultimately, I think that my own recommendation there. I mean, I think that as a person who's convinced that the Christian faith is in fact true, I think the best thing one can do is to believe in God and follow His word as articulated in the Christian scriptures. But I mean, I think that even if that is unpalatable, I mean, there are I don't want to say there are other things. I mean, there are to some extent other things we can do, but I think that having some sort of idea of the transcendent, which again I think is most clearly articulated, right, in belief in God Himself. And then not only is this a matter of belief in dogma, but there's the presence of the Holy Spirit sort of protects one's mind from these things. But I think a sort of a concept of a transcendent ideal, which one gets from recourse to belief in God, to reading literature, and expanding the imagination, to even philosophy, those sort of aspects of the humanities, broaden the mind and imagination in a way that insulates against sort of basically being told what to think, and sort of sham references to authorities such as quote unquote the science, right? To say this is what you must believe. That's what I would say. I mean, it's sort of been the answer for a long time, but the belief in the transcendent, which again I think is most clearly articulated in the Christian religion, is that which insulates, I think, one's mind from this sort of thing. It's also interesting, right, that in the West, right, the church has always been, right, sort of a site of resistance against totalitarianism, right? Not all articulations. I mean, famously, that I think that there was a sect of the large sect of the German church that went right along with Hitler and the Nazis, but there was also a dissenting, right? The Confessional Lutheran Church stood against, right, the rise of Nazism. So, that's I think the best thing to find, the belief in the transcendent.
But now we have like the second problem is that if we like quote like believe in something is transcendent, then but in Western culture they want to abandon transcendent, and how still people can understand, okay, we need this like transcendent and believe something greater than ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, there's sort of two directions to answer that. I mean, one I've already said, right, that God is ultimately not dependent on our belief. And so, I mean, the reality of God, I think, we can't leave that completely out of court. Western culture may not want to believe in Him anymore, but if He still exists, he's going to have a large part in things. And the second thing I think in some senses is that we're more than, we're not Vulcans, right? For those of you familiar with the Star Trek, right? I mean, we're not completely cold reasoned, creatures who simply act based on logic. I mean, so I think, when you find Western culture, I have some of these arguments with my colleagues. I do think reasoned argument is important. Please don't understand me to be saying that reasoned argument is not important. But I also think that the appeal to our imaginations and emotions is important. One of the reasons I'm really interested in this idea of heroism right now is that I think that the literary and imaginative hero speaks to something ideal in our makeup as human beings, and I think that through literature, for instance, right, that art and literature, this appeal to heroism is something that runs an end around and goes right past all of these sorts of cultural attempts to sort of debunk or deconstruct these things. And you know, so for instance, I mean, although, well, obviously, you know, some of this sort of deconstructive thought is influencing recent productions of Hollywood, but even, you know, hero movies, right? They get right past some defenses that the Academy might try to erect around certain sorts of literary texts like Homer, and simply, you know, sort of deep in our souls or our guts, you know, impact us in a way that I mean, we may reasonably say, okay, no, God is dead, that this transcendent doesn't exist, but we can feel it, right? We feel that there's something more to life than well, as Alfred Lord Tennyson said, you know, more than just breathing, right? There's something transcendent involved in being a human being, and we feel it if we don't know it.
Nick, I said we Christians talked about this. How say God, like God interferes, like in our life, like this something happened. Okay, something happened, but like there's like okay random events, but something okay. I met this person, then I met this person, but also like this is called synchronicity. It's pretty same thing that just this thing happened. Okay, we don't know how, but it just happens, and we're gonna explain it.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, and sometimes, right, yeah, I mean, there's you know, one of the classic theological defenses of the existence of God has been the appeal to teleology or order, right? That there seems to be some sort of design in this whole thing, and so yeah, I think that it again, it makes, you know, it makes sense of a lot of things to have this sort of recourse to the divine transcendent, and that doesn't mean that we should believe it simply because it makes sense of things, but you know, if it's true, right, then that's one of the things it will do, is make sense of the various events of life, and yeah, so I think so.
Also, that we can think about okay that the science problem is that also it's like say grounded in a material world, and also like
Yes.
I think it's like its nature is like more like computer thinking, like you need like data, and then you make and then you generalize it, and you can get some information. But if you think about our experiences, okay, like example, like example, I want to save my life. Okay, I eat healthy, and I want to do is like remove sugar, and after that, my health, everything like improves, and some just come along and say, okay, now it's like very different kind of sugar and so on, and there are types, and but again, okay, I understand. Okay, I understand, but my experience is different. Okay, I feel better, I mean like more alive, and then before that, I think problem is science that this doesn't understand this like everyday experiences, and just that are very like individual.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, from what you're saying, right? I mean, it's true that, you know, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, science doesn't account in its systematization for the experience of the individual in quite the same way, right? That your transcendent does. I mean, which again, I mean, science has its place. I absolutely believe that, right? But there is there are experiences for most individuals for which, you know, science can't account. I mean, there's a famous line in Hamlet, right, where Hamlet says to Horatio, right, that there's more in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, right, Horatio. And I think that this is kind of this idea that there's if we're honest with ourselves, most of us have some sort of sense simply in our own experience that something must be bigger, right, than simply this just material world that we're surrounded in. And I think that's, you know, those are that's Psalm 19 says the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth is handiwork, right? That's that sort of reference to the transcendent that's bigger than we are, that each of us have some experience of. I think I do. I mean, in that regard, that if we can see it, right, that it's there.
But Cory, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate
and having a very great conversation.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, and Bye.